I'm Bruce Palmer, President of the Jewish Federation of the Sacramento region. We are pleased that you are here with us tonight for our program, How the Abraham Accords Are Changing the Face of the Middle East, a roundtable discussion with citizens from Israel, the Gulf States, and Morocco. It's not often that we have the opportunity to hear firsthand about the impact of important and historic diplomatic agreements that will not only affect the safety and health of the State of Israel and many of its neighboring nations, but also the entire region and beyond. When the Consul General's office reached out to the Federation with this opportunity, we knew we wanted to make this program happen, and we are grateful to all the parties involved, including the Mayor's Office, B'nai Israel, and others who worked quickly to pull this off so that we could be here tonight. We hope you enjoy this informative and important program. We will have time for questions after the panel, but for technical reasons, we will only be accepting questions from attendees who are here in person. For that, we apologize to those who are attending virtually. It's now my pleasure to introduce my friend, our great Mayor of Sacramento, Darrell Steinberg. Thank you, Mayor, for taking the time here tonight and for your support of the State of Israel and this program. The floor is yours.
Good evening and welcome. Bruce, it is an honor to be here. I thank the Jewish Federation of Sacramento. I thank Rabbi Alfie, Rabbi Galit, for hosting us here tonight. I think the world is desperate for hope. The world is desperate for real-life examples of people and peoples finding ways to live together in peace. And that is why tonight's event, which I know is still in the midst of the end of our pandemic, I should note that though there aren't a lot of people here in person, although it's quality as opposed to quantity, by the way, that there are at least 100 people, I'm told, watching virtually, and this will be recorded for many others to see. And I hope that people watch tonight to see peace in real time. The Abraham Accords, of course, are a series of treaties normalizing diplomatic relations between Israel and the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, and Morocco. An agreement with Sudan is currently under consideration, but its conclusion has been delayed by what we now know are some very difficult political events. These agreements were negotiated in 2020 with the active assistance of the United States. And the United States government today continues to seek expansion of normalization to other countries, between Israel and other countries, which according to news reports include Oman, Saudi Arabia, and Indonesia. The agreements are called the Abraham Accords for a very good reason: to honor the shared history of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. The Accords are the first Middle East peace agreements to be successfully negotiated since Israel ratified peace treaties with Egypt and Jordan over 30 years ago. Since the ratifications, the Abraham Accords have seen the flourishing of cultural and economic ties between the signatory countries. And I know that our guests have been traveling the country here, or at least California, for an eight-day education trip. And we're so honored that you came to the capital city of California, our Sacramento, where we work to practice what we preach, and where we look to practice when it comes to our relationships between our diverse community, to practice what you are pioneering in the Middle East. And I want to welcome Kais Manufi here, who is our friend and one of the great leaders of the Muslim American community. Has done more than just about anybody to say that our friendship, our relationships can be a model for everywhere else in the country. Kais, really appreciate you being here tonight. Thank you. And thank you to the Consul General as well of Israel for being such leaders in promoting peace and reconciliation. The flourishing of these cultural ties of a new peace movement is exemplified by the panel we have with us here tonight. We're here under the auspices of Sharaka, which means partnership in Arabic, a nonprofit organization jointly based in the UAE, Bahrain, and Israel, and co-hosted by the Consul General of Israel for the Pacific Northwest. Let me introduce the distinguished panel who, without further ado, you will hear from. And I know that some of the panelists are not yet here. They're traveling from the Bay Area. And for the first time in the history of Northern California, there's traffic on Highway 80. And so they will be here momentarily, and we will improvise, and as we always do, and make this work so that we can hear from everyone. And is Hayvi Bouzo here yet? No. Not yet. Okay. He is a Syrian-born television journalist of Kurdish descent. He will be here in a few moments, who is currently the Washington, D.C. bureau chief for Orient News. She is the best known. She is best known as the main host of the political television show, The Axis. We will welcome her when she comes. Dan Feferman. Is Dan here? What? Okay. Well, we're leading up to the people who are here, by the way. Is an Israeli-American author, speaker, researcher, consultant, and thought leader who focuses on Israel, the Jewish world, and the Middle East. He publishes and speaks regularly in Israel and internationally, and is the co-host of the podcast Jewanced. That's Jewanced. He also serves as Director of Communications Global Affairs at Sharaka, our host here tonight. Lorena Khateeb. That's Lorena, who I got to take a picture with earlier, is an Israeli Druze who works for the Israeli Foreign Ministry in the Department of Digital Diplomacy. She was a member of the first Israeli delegation to visit the UAE as part of the Abraham Accords. She is a founding member of Sharaka and is active within Israeli society, encouraging minority groups to seek active leadership roles. Lorena, welcome to you tonight. We look forward to hearing from you. Omar Busaidy. Saeed, right there.
No, it's not me, but...
Well, hello anyway. He's a Fulbright scholar, author and economic affairs liaison at the Consulate General of the United Arab Emirates in New York. He is also the co-founder of the Creative Space Events Management based in Saudi Arabia and is the CEO of Sharaka. Fatema Harbi is a published fiction writer, youth and cultural activist with experience in the fields of management and governance. She also serves as vice chairperson of Sharaka Bahrain. Welcome to you. Welcome to our city and to our synagogue. Shama Mchtali is a Dubai-based jewelry designer and entrepreneur, originally from Morocco. She is the founder and CEO of Moors and Saints, a jewelry company with a vision of cultivating pluralism and tolerance in society and empowering women and disadvantaged communities. Last but not least, Nimrod Palmach is a consultant and the former CEO of Ain Pratt Academy for Leadership in Israel. Nimrod has worked for over a decade in multiple entrepreneurial and leadership programs throughout Israel. He's a member of Sharaka's team in Israel. Barry Broad, who was going to be sort of the co-moderator, had a family emergency, and so cannot be here tonight. And we thank Barry for all of his leadership. But we do have with us my friend Don Gilbert, leader in the Jewish American community here in Sacramento for many, many years. I'm going to turn it over to Don Gilbert to begin the conversation. Am I introducing Willie Reck first?
No, I'm just going to take this away so that...
There you go. Here is the mic. Okay. Let's have a great evening. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. As the mayor mentioned, we're going to improvise a little due to logistical challenges with Highway 80. So I want to also introduce our last panelist, Ben Dror Yamini, over here, who is a highly regarded journalist for Yediot Achronot. He's a Jewish Israeli, and he's the author of a well-known book called Industry of Lies, which is goes to the boycott, divestment, and sanction movement and exposes that. So thank you, everybody, for coming, and hopefully in a few minutes, your colleagues. It's also, as the mayor mentioned, it's really kind of enjoyable to be talking about peace in the Middle East between Israel and other parties and among Israelis. And I was thinking about it a little bit, you know, and what I was thinking about, we're talking about peace, prosperity, tolerance, collaboration, vision, moderation, and certainly courage. And it's just, we don't get to do that enough, and hopefully that will be the majority of what we do, you know, for the next 70 some odd years of Israel's existence with its friends in the Middle East. So thank you for being here and welcome to Sacramento. Barry Broad and I worked on these questions together, so if you like them, you're welcome. If you don't, I'll blame Barry. Okay, so I'm going to ask this first question of all of you. How did each of you become involved in this effort to engage in public discussion of the impact of the Abraham Accords on your lives and on your fellow citizens in your respective countries? And maybe we'll just start with Fatema and work our way down.
Hello? Okay. Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. I've started, thankfully, I've been raised in very open-minded family. I've been taught to accept all religions and backgrounds since I was a kid. I've studied also abroad in Australia. So I'm used to being around people from all backgrounds and ethnic groups. When the Abrahamic Accord was announced in September last year, I was so happy that the impossible is possible. So I've been tweeting about it, talking about it with my friends, my family, and just 1 month later, Sharaka have approached me telling me, you seem very excited about the peace deal. Do you want to come and visit Israel? I was like, yes, of course. I wanted to know the unknown. People in Bahrain have been taught that Israel is the evil figure in Middle East. So I wanted to go and see, is it really evil in real life or not? I didn't want to hear about it. I wanted to see it by myself. So thankfully, I was the first Bahraini youth non-governmental official to visit Israel after the Abrahamic Accord. And what I saw, it was completely the opposite. There was nothing evil about Israel. People were living their life normally, filled with life, with joy, living with their Muslim brothers and sisters. I've loved it, and I took what I've seen through my social media platforms to show the people back in Bahrain how it is really like. It's not like the media shows it, and people were shocked. They started asking questions. They've never seen Israel in a good way, and how it is, without any filters. So people were happy about it, and they kept asking me question, how can we get there as soon as possible? We want to see it as you saw it. And that was the beginning for me.
So good evening again. First of all, it's our honor and pleasure to be here with you. I will begin by introducing myself. My name is Lorena Khateeb, as my friends mentioned. I'm from the north of Israel. I'm a Druze, Israeli Arab. Have you ever heard about the Druze community? Yes? Okay. So actually, I'm one of the co-founders of Sharaka. Sharaka is a non-profit organization that bring people together from the Gulf countries and Israel. Actually, I work also at the Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs, at the Digital Diplomacy Department, at the at the Arabic Language Division. We are reaching like daily more than 10 million followers and people from all over the Arab world. I'm also a project manager at the organization Together Vouch for Each Other that connects the Israeli Arab society to the Israeli society. Hi. Okay. Since 1956, when the leader of the Druze community have signed an agreement with the government that every 18 Druze citizens have to join the army beside women and religious people, I decided to do 1 year of national service. So I did it at the Druze community organization in order to bring the Druze community also to the Israeli society. So then I got involved also in reservist on the duty project. I went to Holocaust exploring delegation with my colleagues, and I was there like the only Israeli Arab between like 50 Palestinians and Jewish. So I have faced a lot of misleading conceptions about Israel. So I felt that I'm responsible to do something with that as an Israeli Arab. So then I started to advocate for Israel, especially in my native language, in Arabic. I saw that people are very curious to get to know Israel. So I was dedicating myself to building ties also with our friends from the new countries, Arab countries from all over the world that wants to know more about Israel. So how that's all my activity began.
Thank you, Lorena. Thank you for having us here. I have to admit that actually sitting here and being here with you, with this kind of delegation that have a lot of meetings with a lot of groups, it's a dream coming true. Because I'm older enough to know that some 10 and 20 years ago, it was not, we could not even dream about something of that kind. And my personal story with the peace process, the peacemaking with the Arab countries begins with many years ago when I went all the way to meet Yasser Arafat before the Oslo Accords in Tunisia. And years went on. Peace did not come, unfortunately. Now we see a change. Now we see a change in the Arab world because all the way, we always have, as human beings, we have to choose between two directions. One direction is that people are coming and criticizing Israel. Fair enough. To criticize Israel is fair enough. I do it myself as a journalist. Many times I don't like the policies of my government. But it's going much more. In many times we are speaking about demonization of Israel. We are speaking about BDS. We are speaking about people that don't even recognize the right of Israel to exist. This is one way. The other way is to humanize the other side. To accept the other side, not to say that he is a monster. And the whole idea of the Abraham Accords is that we accept the other. People sometimes do not understand the meaning, the real meaning of Abraham Accords, because the impact of the Accords, it's much bigger than what we think. I'll give you just one example because we don't have a lot of time and my colleagues arrived and they want to speak too. Just one example. Following the Abraham Accords, there was a survey in the Arab world of Zogby institution. I guess many of you are familiar because it's a Washington-based institution. And they were asked, the Arabs in Arab countries, are you in favor of normalization with Israel? Even without peace with the Palestinians, because of the difficulties that we will not get into the story. It's a lecture for itself, which I shall not give now. But they were asked, and surprise, surprise, most of the Arabs in the Gulf countries, but not only in the Gulf countries, in Saudi Arabia, in Jordan, in Egypt, are in favor with normalization and peace with Israel. It's because of the Abraham Accords. Now, from one hand, we have this kind of coalition of what? Of Hamas, of Iran, of people around the world, even in the West, and I have to put it on the table, that are against the very existence of Israel, that they are in favor of BDS, they are in favor of hatred. From the other side, we have Arabs and Jews supporting peace and reconciliation. So it is a dream coming true. Now, the big question is, who is going to win? The axis of Iran and BDS and Hamas, or the axis of those who are striving for peace and reconciliation and mutual recognition, and yes, also peace with the Palestinians? Of course we need it. But the way to achieve peace with the Palestinians is by this kind of activities, is by recognition, is by reconciliation, not by hatred, not by BDS, not by boycott, not by Iran and jihad. So I'm so glad to be here because there is a hope. There is a hope that from the two coalitions, the coalition of peace and reconciliation is going to win, and we have to work on it, all of us together. And I give the mic to a wonderful journalist that her name, she will tell it, she will say it, but her name, the translation of her name is Hope. Please.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Ben-Dror. Thank you so much all for waiting for us. I want to apologize for our delay. We've been stuck in traffic for I don't know how long, but our hearts are with you, and thank you for waiting to start the program for today. We're very happy to be here. My colleagues Nai and Den is just walking right now. My name is Hayvi Bouzo. I was born in Damascus, Syria, raised there. My mom grew up in the Jewish quarter in Aleppo. She was born and raised in the Jewish quarter, so we grew up hearing the stories about the Jewish community in Aleppo, the ancient Jewish community that was basically pushed out of Syria systematically, and my mom told us very sad and heartbreaking stories of her witnessing her friends and neighbors being basically forced out, literally. And my father, who's from Damascus, I'm also partly Kurdish, my mom is half Turkish. It's a mixture, but like the Middle East, the way it is, told us about the Jewish quarter that I actually seen in Damascus, in the very old city of Damascus, inside of the fence, which only few neighborhoods are there because it's really ancient in the city and before other communities came, including, Arabs, Islam, all of that. So this part of our history in the Middle East, and that includes, of course, Jerusalem and the land of Israel, is not being taught by anybody in the region in Arabic language. So you don't know about the indigenousness of the Jewish people inside of the Middle East. And so growing up, wanting to be a journalist and wanted to share stories and educate people, because that's what journalism should be, I actually had a TV show where I started talking about things from a different narrative. I had a rabbi who was helping Syrian refugees after the Syria war, and I also had a program about the Good Neighbor Project that Israel, the IDF, was doing to help Syrians who were actually displaced and were stuck on the Israeli borders. Hundreds of thousands of Syrian families were being helped. And that basically, and there's a lot of factors why people started really wondering and asking the questions about Israel, about the Jewish history. Things that were hidden are now being uncovered. But thanks to the Abraham Accords, we have now governments, finally, who are actually doing those extra steps and allowing people to safely connect and be together and have these conversations, specifically young people. And the difference between the Abraham Accords and previous peace agreements between Israel with Egypt and Jordan is that the previous peace agreements did not allow for that conversation. Because we saw a very famous, for example, Egyptian writer, his name is Ali Salem, who, when he went to visit Israel, he was punished and marginalized in Egypt. But the Abraham Accords are different because now these governments, Arab governments, are actually promoting people-to-people conversations and dialogue. And this is the path forward for the Middle East. There's no other solution but peace. And I definitely think that it's really important that you're here, that we're having this conversation in the United States too, because unfortunately, because of the polarization in the political sphere in the United States has also affected how people look at peace in the Middle East, and kind of saw it from an angle of what's happening here, which has nothing to do with that. I recently, on a TV show called Middle East Rise, very quickly, I also had conversations after the Abraham Accords with people talking about interreligious dialogue, and I had a rabbi, a sheikh, and a priest more than once, which is not the beginning of a joke, it's actually the show that I had on. And people were really happy to just kind of share and ask questions. We've had people troll online, but generally speaking, people were just really had a lot of questions and wanted to learn. And this is just the beginning of having and creating a new Middle East where there's peace and prosperity. And my colleagues can add a lot more about this. Thank you.
Thank you, Hayvi. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having us. My name is Shama Mishtali. I grew up in Morocco, in Casablanca, in a Muslim family, although my grandfather, from my father's side, came from a Jewish family and married a Muslim woman. And so growing up, I was nurtured by these stories of interfaith dialogue that are very deep and deeply entrenched in Moroccan society that my father was telling me about. And so while at home, there was this sort of longing and beautiful storytelling about Muslim-Jewish dialogue and interfaith. When I stepped into the public space and when I went to school, I noticed that Jewish history in Morocco wasn't taught, it was not represented in the media. So very, very early on, I started advocating for the inclusion of that history in public schools. I was the first person to advocate for the inclusion of Amazigh, indigenous Jewish history in the Moroccan curriculum. And I ended up going to Brandeis University in Massachusetts for undergrad. I studied international relations and conflict resolution with a focus on the Middle East and a minor in Hebrew. And that was obviously my introduction to Ashkenazi Jewry and gave me a lot of fluency in the Jewish world, and also exposed a lot of the differences and the nuances about the Jewish world. And the reason why that's important is because it also started to kind of expose some of the nuances within the Muslim world, and sort of to give me this understanding of how to bridge all of these cultures and these identities, not just in the East, but also in the West. I worked in refugee advocacy in the Mediterranean after Brandeis, and I worked in the Moroccan Parliament in the Division of International Affairs and Cooperation. and then moved to Dubai 5 years ago, where I set up a startup using Moorish design and architecture as a way of telling the stories of coexistence and interfaith dialogue and cultural syncretism, specifically between Islam and Judaism, but also related to other faiths across the globe, and really kind of mapping the similarities between Islam and Judaism across sacred sites all over the world, so whether they're Jewish or Muslim or Christian. So for example, we have a collection that's inspired by a mosque that was built 1,000 years ago in Cairo, where we find Stars of David. And the university that was built right next to this mosque was actually founded by a Jewish man from Iraq, originally from Iraq, who ended up converting to Islam. So I sought to kind of complicate the picture a little bit and to dismantle the otherness that exists or existed for a long time across decades of media manipulation and decades of misinformation about the other side. And I had done that before moving to the UAE, specifically focusing on art and visual arts and sort of painting in ways that represent Jewish history in the Middle East and North Africa, and kind of setting up exhibitions and in academic spaces also, where I would use arts to kind of dismantle that otherness. So for example, I had a solo exhibition in Boston in 2012, and I had a lot of people come over from the Muslim diaspora in the Massachusetts area, and they noticed I had these paintings of Jewish women on the wall, and they looked at their attire and the jewelry and everything and their faces, and they said, "How did you get a picture of my grandmother?" And I would say, "But she's Jewish, so what do you think?" And so slowly they would start to kind of dismantle those barriers of otherness that they had built up over the years. One thing I would like to maybe add on or sort of correct that was mentioned before me is that the Abraham Accords, in a way, in the region didn't initiate something new. There was always this sort of longing amongst a lot of people in the Muslim world to reconnect with the Jewish world and to engage with Israel, even though in many cases it was small or it was contained or it was less public. But the Abraham Accords give us a chance for more scalability of that kind of work, more visibility, because in the Middle East and North Africa, we need the leadership to open certain doors for that kind of work, and to allow that work to be more sustainable, more impactful, and more scalable. So in a way, it's a continuation of the history of the region. Of course, there were a lot of times when Muslim-Jewish dialogue reached its peak in the region, and Andalusia serves as an example of that, and the concept of convivencia. And of course, when you look at the development of the Hebrew language, Hebrew went into its golden era because of the proximity with the Arabic language. So in a sense, the Abraham Accords are allowing us to come back to a Middle East of pluralism and to celebrate the multitude of identities in the region.
Hi everyone. Again, apologies for slight delay. My name is Omar al-Busaidy. I'm from the United Arab Emirates, specifically Dubai. I'm an author, a Fulbright scholar. I did my master's at Florida State in International Affairs. And the way I got involved with Sharaka, our organization, if somebody may have translated the word, it means partnership in Arabic, is that I've always been an advocate for coexistence and tolerance. And I got this first from my home and my parents, but also from the leadership of our country. If you haven't been to the UAE yet, the UAE was founded in 1971. Next month, actually, we're celebrating 50 years. It's a golden jubilee. And yeah. Oh, thank you. Thank you very much. Toda. I'm learning my Hebrew now from Mr. Dan Feferman. In the UAE, we're like 9 million people, out of which the UAE citizens, we're only like 10%. or maybe 10%. And so when you have people from all over the world, different cultures, religions. By the way, we've always had a Jewish community in the UAE. It was only natural for me to celebrate the accords when they were announced last year. And I think, I also will second Shama. What the Abraham Accords did is just ignite that longing from the Muslim world and Arabs to just really meet and finally connect with their Jewish cousins, literally. And that's what it made possible. There were lots of Israelis who used to travel to the UAE for business, etc. But then, I used to actually receive them and speak to these delegations when they used to come there. So what happened is, like I said, I celebrated the accords on my social media accounts when it was announced last year. The founders of Sharaka reached out to me and said, listen, you're an Emirati who lives in the US. Would you be interested in leading the organization in the US? So I'm now the CEO of Sharaka USA. I love it. This is our second delegation. We had our first delegation, went to New York, Boston, and Atlanta, spoke to many different communities there. They were very welcoming, and many of them were tearful, because when they heard our stories and saw the activities that Sharaka is organizing in the UAE. We celebrate a lot of cultural events. There's the Lag Omar event, for example. We did it during Ramadan in the desert in Dubai. So it was iftar and Lag Omar. So celebrating both of these cultures. We had a lot more that maybe Dan can explain later on. And we're here to share the story and to the story, this new narrative that's taking place in the Middle East. Because unfortunately, in the Western media, as Ben Dror mentioned, does not cover here. So we felt it was necessary for us to be present to tell you the story firsthand, for also the team on Zoom and everybody in the virtual world. And we hope that you carry our message forward to other people as we hear our stories. Thank you.
We had one more fashionably late arrival here.
So if there's one thing that the Middle East and the U.S. have in common, and that's traffic jams and accidents. So thank you for your patience in that matter. So my name is Dan Feferman. I'm now the Director of Global Affairs and Communications for Sharaka. I'm based in Israel. As you can tell by my thick accent, actually, I was originally born in the U.S. I grew up in Indiana to an Israeli-American family in Indiana. And I moved back to Israel, I should say, in 2005. I spent close to a decade in the Israel Defense Forces in the national security world as a Middle East and national security policy analyst and advisor, and a few other things. Since then, I've been a research fellow at a Jerusalem-based think tank, where I focus on primarily Jewish world issues, Israel diaspora relations, trends in Israeli society, trends in the American Jewish society, and hopefully in the next couple months I'll be publishing my second book on these matters. I lecture, I podcast, and consult on a variety of matters. The story of the Abraham Accords, the story of Sharaka, of what we're doing, is essentially my story. I guess every one of us kind of has that story that comes together, and that's why we're all here. I've always been fascinated with the Middle East. Israel, of course, is part of the Middle East, but unfortunately, because of the conflicts, we've been cut off. And even inside of Israel, as Lorena mentioned, we have close to a quarter of our country is actually an Arab minority. And while we get along on a day-to-day basis, it's hard to say that most Israelis and most Israeli Jews and most Israeli Arabs have close personal connections. Some do. It's getting better, I think. But on the day-to-day level, we don't. And because of the conflicts and because of the region, we've been cut off from our neighbors, from our cousins. Now, I don't know if most of you probably know this. More than half of Israeli Jews have their origins in the Middle East. My family, half of my family came from Iraq. Iraqi Jews who had to flee in the 1950s because of growing anti-Semitism. And that story is not unique in Israel. So the Arab and the Middle Eastern culture and the language and the foods and the music are as much a part of my growing up as they are for many Israelis, but we could never really openly travel. I then spent my college years studying the Middle East and studying Arabic. I then spent a decade in the military, being engaged in the region in a very different way. And I continued to lecture over the years, and in those lectures, I went back over my notes recently, and you notice a progression of developing regional trends and the signs, and I could see this because I looked at the updated lecture notes every couple months of every version of the lecture, and the growing signs of closeness between Israel and the Gulf countries. You could see it in the notes as a progression, because anyone who watches, and that was my job, one by one, a sports delegation, a public ministerial visit, an Arab government in the Gulf wishing Rosh Hashanah, blessings to the Jewish people, one by one. When the Abraham Accords were announced, I was invited to join in a group. I helped found a group called the Uae Israel Business Council, and I was one of the first Israelis to visit the Gulf. I have an American passport, so I even beat my fellow Israelis out there before the visa agreements were in place. And I got out there, and I toured a little bit, but what I mostly did was I met people that I'd been networking with online for months already, getting to know them. And every single Emirati, and not just Emiratis, Syrians, Palestinians, Egyptians, Iranians who live in the UAE, and who I was meeting one by one, it was like we were long-lost brothers and sisters who just couldn't talk to each other for the longest time. Every conversation was an immediate connection, a deep conversation. And I realized a couple of things. I said, first of all, there's a new Middle East here. And maybe it's not a new Middle East. Maybe it's the old Middle East we just were cut off, like you said, that we're cut off from. But there's a new Middle East for us, at least. The Accords were a watershed moment in our modern history, okay? It's a watershed moment in that the region, the day before and the day after, will not be the same. It lifted a sand curtain, so to speak, like the Iron Curtain, a sand curtain of legitimacy for these things that have been happening for the better part of a decade since the Arab Spring, of people realizing they've been lied to, people realizing they've been radicalized, people realizing they've been divided and conquered for too long for cynical political reasons. And through social media and through access to the internet and through travels abroad, this groundswell of young, hopeful, educated people who we all just want better lives for ourselves said, can this be the only way? Can there be a better way? And we need to be talking to these people in Israel. I saw a vision of the Middle East that is moderate, that is forward-looking, that is pragmatic, that is open, that is tolerant. Everything we were told the Arab world isn't. Everything we were told in Israel that the Muslim world isn't, and in the West. And I saw women's rights, I saw women's empowerment, and I came back, again, I was one of the first Israelis who went, and people couldn't believe the things that I was saying. Like Omar, I was interviewed on TV, I was writing in papers, I was active on my own, and Sharaka called and said, would you like to join us? And I said, this is the opportunity of a lifetime to join these people and others who are not here today, to make sure that these governmental agreements are translated and expanded on the people-to-people level. And we need to grow this movement, we need to grow this circle, and that's what we're trying to do back in the Middle East, and that's the story we're here to tell you today.
Well, first I want to welcome the 4 fashionably late arrivers to Sacramento, and we really appreciate your time. And wow, in your really impressive, thoughtful, comprehensive introductions, you basically got my 12 questions out of the way. So we're gonna have to talk food and sports right now. but you got about 10 of them. So, but I can improvise since that's the theme of the evening. So, two-part question. I think we're gonna so that you can answer more questions if you're okay with it. Why don't we divide you into one group of three? Not divide because you're partners. Two partnerships. One partnership of three on the left and one partnership on the three of the right. That's in honor of our partisanship here in America. But so we'll do that. So for the partnership group on the left here, so just it feels like to some extent the Abraham Accords and attitudes in your countries of origin towards the Abraham Accords maybe are somewhat generational, and wondering if you could talk about that, and then sort of second part. Well, actually, let's just stick with that. In the second part, I'll ask the other group. So, whoever wants to go.
Okay. I'll speak about Morocco, and then I'll leave it to my colleagues to speak about the UAE and Syria and the region. In the case of Morocco, the relationship between Israel and Morocco goes back to 1948. Morocco has always maintained relationships with Israel. Sometimes was more open, sometimes less so. Morocco had a liaison office in Tel Aviv throughout the 90s that was shut down in 2000 following the Intifada and pressure because Morocco was part of the Arab League and still is, and there was pressure following the Intifada to shut it down, and we had the king had just stepped into power in 1999, so he was a young king under a lot of pressure to consolidate power. However, because the cultural and social ties and relationships are historical and extremely deep, even in the context of political differences or the freezing of certain political relationships, the cultural relationships and social relationships remained. And this is due to, first of all, the biggest factor is that Israel counts a massive Moroccan Jewish community. 1 in 9 Israelis is Moroccan on both sides, and then there are a lot of people who are mixed Moroccan and Ashkenazi and other things. The other thing is, even after the departure of the biggest members of the Moroccan Jewish community, there remained traces, of course, and sacred spaces and cemeteries. And Morocco is the only country in the region that has a Jewish museum. So there was exposure in some ways to the Jewish history in the country. Of course, over the last few decades, we have obviously suffered a rise in fundamentalist ideology that has restricted not just civil liberties and the consciousness of the history, but also the extent to which people express that complexity and that story around Moroccan Jewry. And specifically within the last 10 years since the Arab Spring in 2011, of course, we've had 3 Islamist governments successively, and I myself was censored for showcasing Jewish art in Casablanca, and repeatedly even before that, I would get invited to exhibit my paintings, and then sort of last minute would be told that there's no way to do that. Again, because the government just had no tolerance for representing that kind of pluralism. However, it's strategic for the leadership of the country to also fight the forces of extremism. So there has been this calculated and strategic effort to counter extremism by highlighting the pluralism in the country and sort of enforcing an agenda of interfaith dialogue and tolerance. But the social fabric already exists to support that. And there's there was always civil society working in that direction. Even before the Abraham Accords, many activists who were pro-normalization went to Israel and came back to write about it in Arabic and to speak about it in the Moroccan language. And again, these stories would never really make it to the US or to the West, but it always existed because I'll share with you an anecdote because there's this deep feeling that part of understanding Moroccan history or North African history relies on understanding Jewish history. And this is specifically common amongst sort of the most educated or the most activist fractions of society. And I'll share with you a quick story about this. I was at an event with the Israeli ambassador last month in Morocco with civil society actors and activists, and they said, look, if you sort of scrape off or scratch the skin of a Moroccan, you find out that first they're Amazigh, so they're indigenous. And second, if you do it another time, you find that they're Jewish. So there's this deep consciousness of that history that unfortunately, because of the politics and the ideologies that were ruling and sort of dictating what kind of policies took shape in the region, there was less openness about this recognition. And maybe now I pass it to Hayvi. Yeah.
Yes, quickly, I actually would talk about it from a different angle because, you know, I was born in Damascus, Syria, and as you know, it's different from North Africa. The political situation and the development that happened in the last decade, which Dan mentioned, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, these are countries that in the last decade, there was a complete domination by Iranian-backed militias. And the Iranian regime has basically spread a narrative that is very anti-Israel, very militant, that is basically just aims to the destruction of Israel. And this has been also obviously Hamas in Gaza. But what happened in the last decade, that this narrative that has been brainwashing people, and there's a propaganda machine because of the regimes in that area too, were responsible to do exactly that and follow the same narrative. People started seeing in the last decade how these militias, backed by that regime, were basically slaughtering the people. This has been happening. So people started asking the questions, well, this is what you've been telling us, but this is what you've been doing to us. So people, for example, who defended Hezbollah in 2006, when Hezbollah crossed the borders with Israel, killed and kidnapped Israeli soldiers. People in Syria and Lebanon, Iraq, at that time, they would defend Hezbollah. But what happened later is that the same people who actually used to have even Hassan Nasrallah's pictures on their walls, I remember myself when I would say that this is a terrorist militia, they would say, oh, you're a traitor, how dare you would say this. Now, these same people know that this is a terrorist militia because they saw them kill people on basically sectarian grounds because they're Shia versus Sunni, the same thing. Sunni extremism was funded by the same regime and obviously Muslim Brotherhood. So there is that awakening that happened, and that was one of the factors. Obviously, the world is getting smaller. People started asking questions and seeing that, for example, I mentioned the Good Neighbor Project by Israel. Israel confronting these militias to defend itself because they're encroaching on its borders. So when the questions started being asked, people started learning about the history that was hidden, about Israel's history in the region. People start saying, oh, that's true. In the Quran, for example, Israel is mentioned 43 times. Nobody used to know about this. They didn't question it, even though they saw this because they would read the Quran. And then what about, there's no Palestine is not mentioned. Well, this is another thing. So they start realizing, okay, well, there is a history there. Why isn't there peace? But this access, the Iranian access and the backed militias and the regimes that are in place that are corrupted, they don't want peace. And people realize, okay, well, peace is the only solution. So there are those questions. People are trying to learn. And with the Abraham Accords having the governments being involved in giving that protection for people, we are now starting to see that change. So it is a generational change, but it's also these factors are playing a big role in making it happen.
The one thing that the UAE and Israel share the most is both countries respect tradition but embrace modernism. And the UAE from the very beginning has always been a place where they focused on economic development, prosperity, openness, cooperation, all of these different things that allowed for the leadership and its policies to identify strategic partners and allies to help them achieve the vision of the reality that we see today. You know, everybody knows the UAE, the tallest building, the fastest this, the biggest that, the biggest whatever, every superlative you could think of. Now, having said that, that's why, yes, you know, the UAE is still in the same time, the position in the Gulf where it is, the partners, the neighbors that we have, we could not openly at that time announce that we have relations with Israel. And the biggest cooperation between the UAE and Israel, for decades by the way, was in security. Both countries face common threats, and both countries have the opportunities for progress and etc. is similar as well. They have a lot of opportunities that they can explore and they're working with, and we see today, especially when it comes to space exploration, climate change, agri-tech, etc. So they've always been talking to each other, but it was always on the table. But sometimes, like Shama said, sometimes it would be open, sometimes closed. You would see ministers coming to the UAE, attending a conference, etc., but then it will go away. What happened though, and what led finally to allowing the Abraham Accords to come to fruition, is the UAE said, you know what, let's do this smartly. They established something in 2016, something called the Ministry of Tolerance and Coexistence. Didn't make sense because we were already tolerant and coexisting with everybody. And then then they announced, now I can finally say, as Shama says, it reminds me about what happened in my country. They announced the Year of Tolerance. So they announced the Year of Tolerance, and then they invited the Pope to come to the UAE for the first time, and then they announced something called the Uae Moral Education, where they started to educate children about, you know, accepting people from different backgrounds, etc. And then you would see athletes, Israeli athletes coming to take part in competitions in the UAE. When they win, the national anthem would play, and then you would see ministers attending conferences openly, etc. And then slowly, but surely, the UAE was the first country to announce that they were going to sign the Abraham Accords. And that led the way for Bahrain, Morocco, Sudan, and hopefully other Arab states and non-Arab states to join the Abraham Accords. So that's how they got, you know, they played the stage by stage to get to the point where we are today.
Great. Okay, thank you. For the group on the right there, starting with Fatema, kind of following up on something Dan said, have the Abraham Accords unleashed something in the Middle East that's just not stoppable, that's good, that's not stoppable, or could it be derailed?
For me, to speak about Bahrain's situation, it did. The change has been huge. It's not as much as the UAE, but we started to see the change that the Abrahamic Accord has affected. We're used to see Israel in very negative way. Now, even in the national media outlets or newspapers, we see Israel mentioned every day in a very positive way, and people are not used to it. And I understand it will take time for them to adjust with the new situation. We're having the flights, the direct flights from Bahrain to Israel twice a week. People have started asking how can they get visas, how can they get to Israel. So a lot of new movements are happening in Bahrain, and thankfully it's happening between people to people. It's not on a governmental level only and only some accord signing. So that's the situation in Bahrain. I don't know about Lorena.
So for me, I think that it's kind of a process. We can see this change like in the next few years, but like in the last year, we saw that the UAE and Israel, after the announcement of the peace agreement, did a very cooperation in a few areas and companies and organizations. You know, people always ask me like, Lorena, what do you do? So I always mention that I work like as a construction worker. Like I always build bridges between people. So I think that what we are doing in Sharaka, we are like preparing the ground for the people to get the idea, to get this new path of peace and stability in the Middle East. Like people were raised, brainwashed, and as Fatema said, like saw Israel as an enemy, as a place that you can't go and visit and explore it by yourself. I think that the peace agreements have opened a great opportunity for people from all over the world, the Arab world, to go to Israel and to explore Israel by themselves and to see the reality and to share it with their people in the Arab world. And that's the new change that we are living.
I think all processes, if anything, history teaches us, it's that all processes are reversible. History is not linear. If it was, what was that, you see movies about the future from, 30 years ago, 50 years ago, when we'd all assumed back then that today in 2020 we'd be in flying cars, Back to the Future and floating skateboards and all that. Tom Friedman writing about how everything's marching towards democracy, Fukuyama or Huntington in The Clash of Civilizations. It turns out that history doesn't work that way. It turns out that everything is stoppable, sad to say. Good processes can be halted, but also that means bad processes can also be halted and good ones can be initiated. And I think this, sorry for philosophizing here on stage, but if this moment teaches us, and if our citizens' access to social media, the democratization of access to information, and that we can all become podcasters and journalists and writers and bloggers, teaches us is that we can change history. Now, in this case, we needed the governments to be able to step in here. I'm an optimistic person by nature. I think this unleashed something that has a lot of momentum, but that means we can't just sit back and let it happen. That's why all of us here need to be proactive in this to make sure that it doesn't just stop. You need to have, the only way to fight extremism and negativity is by giving an alternative, a positive alternative, one that shows that cooperation is in everyone's interest. And to drown out the noise of the extremism, you don't do it by extremism, you do it by moderation and positivity. So it was a huge step, but we can't just sit back. We have to be incredibly proactive about this and keep spreading. That's what we're trying to do, but that's what everyone needs to do in order to make sure the momentum, like a snowball, just keeps getting bigger and bigger and more people on board. Or maybe not a snowball, because snowballs run things over. It's like a train. Everyone get on the train, right?
Okay, great answers. Okay, we're going to get in, after I ask one more question to the audience, I'm just going to ask Lorena and Omar this question in the interest of time. If someone's really, really bursting and has to add something quickly, you can add it. Okay, so my question in short is, what about the Palestinians? So Hamas, no surprise, came out, you're traitors, and the Palestinian Authority wasn't that far behind. So how does this affect, what about the Palestinians? Where do they fit into this? What opportunities are there for them? Are they being ostracized, etc.?
It's a great question. First of all, it's very important to note that there are hundreds of thousands of Palestinians that live in the UAE and continue to do so. Number one. Number two, it is true, when the UAE signed the Abraham Accords, the Palestinian Authority removed the ambassador from the UAE, who, by the way, got his salary from the UAE government, and went back, and they also called for an emergency meeting with the Arab League to denounce the Abraham Accords. But the OIC, the Arab League, etc., told the Palestinian Authority that the UAE is a sovereign state and they have the right to take the decisions that they see is necessary for its own interests. Despite the fact that this has happened, the UAE did not do anything to, for example, disrupt the lives of the Palestinians living in the UAE. One, during this pandemic, the UAE continues to send aid to the Palestinians in both the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. In fact, we sent the Russian vaccine, Sputnik, and Hamas actually came out in the media and thanked the Russian government for it, although we were the ones that sent it. So, anyways, it's fine for us as long as the people are going to be okay, they're going to be healthy, they'll be alive and well. That's what matters. Getting that recognition doesn't really matter for us. So we didn't counter back and say, oh no, we were the ones that sent it. We just kept quiet. We were like, fine, we work in silence. If you go on the news right now, you will see that the UAE government is actively working on rebuilding the schools, hospitals, etc., and different projects in Gaza after the conflict that happened earlier this year, but we're still supporting them. If you come right now in the UAE, we have a massive event, the World Fair, or called Expo in Dubai, and when you come there, you will see that we have the 190 countries represented, and you see the State of Israel, and you see State of Palestine. So all of the initiatives that we're taking, and we've always been supportive to the Palestinians from the get-go, just because there's conflict in the region and there's conflict between the Palestinians and Israelis, does not mean that we cannot engage with Israel. We have relations with many other countries that we disapprove of some of their policies, but we still engage with them. So in international relations and international norms, there's rules of engagement, and this is what the UAE believes in and will work with. And in the end of the day, when the Palestinian Authority decides to come and have a conversation with us, our arms are open, and we will have a discussion with them. And hopefully, if they want us to have a seat on the table, instead of always actually bringing the US to try to solve a Middle Eastern problem when you can have a Middle Eastern neighbor to solve Middle Eastern problems, we would be very active in that cause. So that's my take on the UAE and the Palestinians.
I think that every single person, not only the Palestinian people, will benefit from these peace agreements. We all have to remember that in the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, there are two sides. There is the Israeli side and there is the Palestinian side, but the media always trying to cover only the Palestinian narrative. So I think that it begins with us. It begins like Israel have truly given the Palestinian Authority and people hundreds of opportunities for peace, and they ignored. I think this peace agreement, this peace deal with the Palestinians will begin by the Palestinian leadership. And the first step is by recognizing Israel as an independent state. So the Palestinian people are being occupied by the Palestinian leadership, I think, and this peace will help us, the Israeli people, connect more and more with the Palestinian people, and it all begins with dialogue. With the UAE has done a huge step by the announcement of the peace agreements, and I think that it helps all the region, because we saw Bahrain has joined the peace agreements, and then Sudan and Morocco, and hopefully more and more countries will join us. And we have to try. We have tried the path of conflict and war for many years. So we have to try a new way, a new path of peace and stability with the whole region.
Sure, go ahead.
It's burning in me.
I figured, I'm shocked.
Careful, I could talk all night. I'll try not to. Look, the regional strategy that the Palestinians and for a while the Arab world tried was pressure Israel, boycott Israel, isolate Israel, first through war, that failed, then through terror, that didn't succeed, economic boycotts, diplomatic boycotts, etc. It didn't work. It didn't work for the Palestinians, and the region realizes it. The UAE, Bahrain, Morocco, they realize that it's not even helping the Palestinians. If it would, forget that I'm Israeli, go for it. If that's what gets you your goal, do it. It didn't work, and it only made things worse because as an Israeli, I can say it made us more closed off, okay? The less, I remember the Oslo Accords, so I grew up in that generation that was very hopeful, that peace was so close, and we missed it. But today's generation of kids, they only know of the intifada, of the rockets, of Hamas, of suicide bombings, of stabbings. That's the only Arab world they know. I remember a sliver of a Palestinian world where we could have been friends. I still remember that. And the further you get away from that, the more and more and more the Arab, again, because we didn't have that relationship with the broader Arab world, only with the Palestinians, was a negative one. They were scary, they were terrorists, they hated us. We in Sharaka, we're not dealing with that issue. We deal with the broader Arab world. I truly hope, and I think all of us truly hope, that if this can humanize the Arab world, the Muslim world for Israelis, and vice versa, and eventually the Palestinians will realize, it can warm the entire atmosphere around us so that eventually they can come together. It also brings actors like the UAE, like Bahrain, like Morocco to the table as positive influencers on Israel and on the Palestinians to bring them together. I don't think they were ignored, but I do think it was about time that somebody said enough holding everyone hostage to something that's just not working. Let's try a new path. And, from the Arab world perspective, I think they intend that it will lead to a Palestinian something one day in peace, certainly.
I hope you're right. Okay, so we have time for 2 or 3 questions. 2 questions. I'm asking that they be actual questions. The definition of question is not always allowed in the Jewish community. It's not a statement, it's a question. Okay, you want to give this to whomever?
Thank you. My name is Tara. I'm a former, I was born in Iran, and I'm a U.S. citizen. We've been in this country for 44 years. I was just, actually, I just came with a friend to this session. Just came to this program with a friend. I wasn't really very much aware of the Abraham Accord, and I just looked it up. It says a joint statement between State of Israel, United Arab Emirates, and United States of America. And then it says a little further down that it was signed by Emirati Foreign Minister, the Bahraini Foreign Minister, Israeli Prime Minister, and U.S. President Donald Trump, whose position towards Iran is very well known. I don't have any sympathy towards the regime of Iran necessarily, but as somebody who was born in Iran, when I hear from the podium that when you talk about Iran, which is a nation with 7,000 years of history and a huge history of Judaism, I really feel a little surprised that Iran is not, which is very similar to the question you had, part of this shirkat, or sharaka, as you would say it in Arabic, and how you have actually, because I know that country, and I know how I was raised in Iran. There was nothing against Judaism, never. These guys that I am with in their groups, the Salam Shalom, they know that as we were children, we played on accordion Hava Nagila, and recently I just for the first time after many, many years started looking it up and finding out what did that mean, what we constantly sang and danced to. And I actually was raised in a family that was not religious, but from, the Muslim background. So Iran is not just the Iranian government. It is an absolute huge mistake to think that Iranian people are Jewish. And that has to be, when you just say Iran and Hamas and Hezbollah, that's just not Iran either.
Yeah.
Just as much as, you were saying that, not everything that everybody else says about, Israel is what you think of Israel. Thank you.
Can I respond to this? Your point is so important. Thank you so much for this. I used to live in Los Angeles, and a lot of my friends were were Iranians. Many of them were Jewish Iranians, and they would call themselves Persians. They're very proud of the Persian identity, and their community, Jewish and Muslim together. And I know so many Iranians until today, as a journalist covering the Middle East, who are the personally, all of the people that I know are anti the Iranian regime, which is what I'm talking about today in terms of who sponsors these militias. By the way, there are so many videos online, and you can look it up, on the point that you mentioned, where the Iranian regime puts the American and the Israeli flags on the floor for people to step on them when they're walking down the streets. You see none of the people do. They all go around, and in traffic, on the entrance to colleges and universities, in the streets, the videos, nobody would step on the American and the Israeli flags because they know. Actually, they know more than anybody in the region that Israel is an ally, is not an enemy. There is a person that I know in DC. He actually created something called the Cyrus Accords, and he brought a delegation of Iranians who want peace with Israel, and they actually went and visited Israel so they can be like complementary to the Abraham Accords. So the Cyrus Accords is a thing, and it's happening, and so many Iranians have expressed that this is what they want. Like you said, there's a very long history. There's a lot of actually alliance between the Jewish people and the Persians historically in Iran before the Islamic Revolution took over. So yeah, 100%.
We have time for one more question. Does anybody? Rabbi?
Shalom, it's good to see you and listen to this interesting conversation today. As a rabbi, I was wondering if this is an initiative of global, young, cool, secular, generational initiative. I know, I'm just being provocative, I noticed. Or is this more of a global, let's talk about our Western-Eastern relationship? Is there a religious component to this? I'm asking, we're sitting in a synagogue. We all share this. We put aside sometimes, but a lot of the conflict in the Middle East is religious. It has to do with religious conflict and religious origins. So I was wondering, if at all, how you see the religious narratives and practices support, get in the way, help, resist, whatever you think is... see, religion, no one wants to talk about this. It's terrible. Thank you.
I talked a lot. I talked a lot. I know me. I'm just going to say quickly about just like I mentioned this, that I had a couple of shows where I had a rabbi, a sheikh, and a priest, because like you said, it's very important, the religious component and actually having the interreligious dialogues. So we were actually just talking, so people are very curious. We were just talking in the car about an initiative that they want to make and that I actually want to cover journalistically, of having these dialogues because they are so important. People don't know about Judaism, for example. Nobody, it's really the vast majority. People want to learn. And the more you know, the more you feel the closeness and the similarities. and the history, the common history. So definitely this is a very important question, and it should be applied. Yeah.
I'll share a short story. Well, first it started with Omar asking me a very innocent question that turned into an hour-long conversation of what do Jews believe in regard to the afterlife? And it turns out Jehannam, and we got into this entire debate about Judaism, Islam, afterlife. I'll share a short story because I don't want to talk too long. My first trip to Dubai, I went to the UAE, maybe the Arab world's first kosher restaurant, with 3 traditional Muslim Arab friends in traditional dress, and I'm sitting there, and the only Jew at this Muslim table in a kosher restaurant, and we spoke all night, exchanging stories, learning from each other's religions and traditions and histories. And the evening started with me getting up to do netilat yadayim, to wash my hands as we ceremoniously do before we eat bread. And my friend got up to do it with me. He said, I want to do this with you. And we sat down, the 3 of us, and we said motzi together in the heart of the Arab world. And then we spoke until 3 in the morning, exchanging those kind of stories. And we just spoke about it in the car, that this is one of our next initiatives that we're launching for people online to be able to do this. Absolutely.
Okay, I wanted to thank you all. Willie's going to formally thank you, but since I sat on the panel with you, I have to say it's so uplifting, it's so refreshing to hear what you have to say, and it's kind of nourishing for the soul, and I think a lot of what you said, frankly, is a surprise to many in the American Jewish community, in my experience. And so I hope you go talk to a lot more people, and when you're really, really brave, go to college campuses.
We're trying.
Thank you very much. My name's Willie Recht. I'm the CEO of the Jewish Federation, and I just want to thank you all for being here. There are some unpredictable moments in my career as a Jewish communal professional, and this is certainly one of them, and this has been amazing, and I just want to thank you all for being here. We're really appreciative. I want to thank Bruce and Don and Barry, though Barry can't be here, for their work and dedication and time to this program. And I want to thank the mayor for taking the time to join us tonight. Thank you for your support and for taking the time out of your busy schedule to be here for this important program. I also want to thank Kais for being here. Welcome. You are a true friend to us, and we're grateful you're here. And I want to thank our hosts, B'nai Israel and their team, Rabbi Alfie, and especially Leslie, Ryan, and Dean, who worked closely with me to make sure that we were all set. I know they've been doing Zoom services. This is our first program in 20 months in person, or somewhat in person, so we were, it was just one of those things. So this is very special, that we can do this here with you all. And before we close, I think in the apropos of everything that we discussed tonight, I'd like to call up Rabbi Galit Cohen Kedem, CBI's amazing visiting rabbi from Israel, who is really amazing. And I'm just going to say for a second, too, there's not many people who could just pinch hit on Yom Kippur the way that Rabbi did, because, the mayor's wife was unable to be here, but you did an amazing job. So anyways, I'd like to call you up so you can conclude this program with the prayer for peace.
Tada. I know. It's okay. But then I'll be with my back.
No, you'll face the camera.
I forgot the camera. Sorry, cameras. So the prayer for peace, I think, is a global prayer. So I'm just bringing one facet of it in Hebrew, if I may. And shalom and salam, and this root is in all our languages, in all our traditions. So please, let's all open our hearts tonight and think of ourselves as all of the daughters and sons of Abraham, of Ibrahim and Sarah. Shalom Rav al Israel Amcha ve'al olamcha tasim leolam, ki ata hu melech adom lechol hashalom, ve'tov be'enecha לברך את עמך ישראל ואת עולמך בכל עת ובכל שעה בשלומך. ברוך אתה אדוני, המברך את עמו ישראל ועולמו בשלום. Grant abundant peace to Israel your people, and to the humanity your people forever. And you are the sovereign God of all peace. May it be pleasing to you to bless your people, your sons and your daughters of Abraham and Sarah, in every season and moment with your peace. Blessed are you, Adonai, who blesses your people Israel and humanity with peace. Amen.